Good evening. On behalf of students honoring outstanding university teaching, I'd like to welcome you to the 4th Annual Golden Apple Award Lecture. I'd like to begin by thanking Hillel and Apple Computer for sponsoring this event, as they have for each of the past 4 years. We'd like to thank all of our co-sponsors for their continued support as well. I'd like to point out that some of the sponsors were mistakenly left off of the poster but are included on the program, so we'd like to acknowledge their support too, because without them, tonight could not have been possible. Finally, I'd especially like to thank Michael Brooks, Executive Director of Hillel, for the continual guidance and support he gave the Shout Committee throughout this year's process. Tonight is a celebration, not only of Dr. Coppola, but also of student appreciation for teaching excellence. For tonight shows that students not only care about their education, but care especially about who gives it to them. The Shout Committee received over 500 nominations for this year's nominations process. What strikes me most about such wide participation in the nomination process, more so than in years past, is that perhaps the general sense of apathy, which seems to pervade so many aspects of this college campus, isn't as strong as many people may think. In fact, students do appreciate the education they receive here. Professor Coppola, the Golden Apple Award, and your presence here tonight are all testimonies to that appreciation. So thank you for being here, enjoy the evening, and it is now my pleasure to ask Lawrence Deitch, Regent of the University of Michigan, to bring greetings from the university.
Thank you, Gabi. I am privileged to have the opportunity to speak to you for a minute about the Golden Apple Award and my views on the importance of great teaching at the University of Michigan. I attended last year's lecture because I had read in the Daily that my favorite and most influential professor as an undergraduate, Sidney Fine, was getting the 1993 award. I sat in this auditorium and listened to Professor Fine talk about Woodrow Wilson, Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt, and Frank Murphy. As I sat here, I felt transported back to Auditorium A at 11 a.m. in April 1968. As they say in the basketball business, Professor Fine hadn't lost a step. He remained what I remembered, the most engaging and thoughtful lecturer that I had ever heard. A person whose erudition, scholarship, insight, and yes, values profoundly influenced the way I look at and interact with the world. Now, I would have said all that last year, but nobody asked me to speak. And so tonight we honor Professor Brian Coppola. I can't speak with as much experience with Professor Coppola because I was not a student in his class, but I did hear him speak at a presentation on undergraduate teaching made to the Regents about a year ago. And he, too, is a superlative lecturer. I listened to him, and as a person who was a science phobe as an undergraduate, I thought to myself that even Larry Deitch could have learned, and maybe even learned to love, organic chemistry if he had been taught by Brian Coppola. He was wonderful that day, and I know he will be wonderful tonight, and I salute him on this high honor. At this point, you're probably saying to yourself, well, so what? This guy reveres great teachers and is a Sidney Fine freak. But what's his message? My message is simply that as one of the stewards of the public's equity in this great university, I want to turn my respect for great teachers into a commitment to action which will really make great teaching flourish across the board at Michigan. Too often, we, the leadership of the university, say how much we value great teaching, but act differently. In my judgment, we must place far greater emphasis on teaching when it comes to tenure and pay if we really want to put our money where our mouths are. Moreover, as an institution, we must show more basic respect for and give more status to our great teachers. That's what the Golden Apple Award is all about, and I've come here tonight to bring greetings and to associate myself with its underlying premises. We as an entire university community must do the same and I will work toward that end. I am sure that Professor Coppola will always cherish the award because it comes from the university's students. I commend the committee for its hard work and its selection, and I look forward to Professor Coppola's lecture. Thanks again.
Thank you, Mr. Deitch. It is now my honor to welcome Professor Sidney Fine, 1993 recipient of the Golden Apple Award, to say a few words about the award and what it means to this university.
One of the nice things about winning the award is you get praise 2 years in a row. I didn't expect that. I was able to talk as much as I wanted to at last year's ceremony. Tonight I shall be mercifully brief. The Golden Apple Award, as Larry Deitch said, is a very special award. And the Golden Apple ceremony, which we're enjoying this evening, is a very special event in the life of the University of Michigan. What's impressive about the award is not only that it celebrates teaching in so prominent a manner, but that it's the consumers of the university's teaching, the students, who decide who the winner will be. The award is entirely in the hands of the students, and they've acquitted their responsibility in this regard in a thoroughly professional manner. The award ceremony is also, I think, a very special event because it enables the citizens of Ann Arbor, university administrators, university students, and university faculty members to listen to a major lecture by a star teacher whom so many of us have never had the opportunity to hear before. I'm a historian, and I've often said that it is really easy to be a good history teacher because students bring a natural curiosity to the subject on which the instructor can capitalize. I am perhaps revealing my own ignorance, but I do not think that most of our students bring quite the same kind of curiosity to the study of organic chemistry. This is what makes the selection of Professor Coppola as this year's Golden Apple Award winner so very special. He is indeed the first natural scientist to win this award. There's no question, judging from the record and from what two of my own students told me this very afternoon, that Professor Coppola has not only impressed his students with the importance of his subject, but that he has also led them to enjoy it. He has made his own enthusiasm for his subject infectious. I'm delighted to be able to listen to one of the university's great teachers deliver his ideal last lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Fine. It's so nice to have you and 1992 recipient Ralph Williams here as well to join with us in this special evening. Before Professor Coppola gives his ideal last lecture, sorry. We had to be careful about that, sorry. He's asked that he be introduced by his longtime colleague and even longer-time friend, Professor William Pearson.
Well, often introductions start by someone saying, "It gives me great pleasure to blah, blah, blah." And then whether it really does give them big pleasure or not, they go on. But it is truly an honor and a pleasure to introduce Professor Brian Coppola tonight, this year's Golden Apple Award winner. Brian is not only a very close colleague, but as was mentioned, a very close personal friend of mine. I think everyone has a few friends that they go through their life with who they call, a very special friend, and Brian is certainly that to me. We go back a long ways, about 16 years, where we met on the campus of University of Wisconsin-Madison. We both entered graduate school there in organic chemistry together and had the good fortune of actually being in the same research group and even adjoining benches in the same research lab, where we became fast friends. We had a great time there. got into all kinds of trouble, did all kinds of good things. But I was impressed immediately by Brian. He was already a man with a vision and a purpose, even at that stage. I was just a guy who went to graduate school because organic chemistry seemed kind of neat and I didn't know what else to do. But Brian was already interested in becoming a teacher. He didn't know at that point at what level, but he was clearly driven. And I think we both underwent a transformation at Madison because of the man that we work for, Professor Barry Trost, an internationally known organic chemist, but whether he knows it or not, one of the best teachers I've ever been around. I wouldn't say he would describe himself that way, but I think we really had our eyes opened by that man. When I was an undergraduate, and I think when Brian was too, we took organic chemistry, and it was largely an assembly of what seemed to be fairly disjointed facts. And we enjoyed it for whatever reason, and went into that area. But what we both found in graduate school was that we had our eyes opened by Barry Trost that this was it was a very simple subject. It was easily assembled into a conceptual framework that was easy to remember. All of a sudden things became clear to us what was going on. He also taught us how to analyze problems, how to think about chemistry as well as other subjects. He was a very big influence, and I'm sure that shored up Brian's ambition to become a teacher. He, after his PhD, he went to the University of Wisconsin at Whitewater, where he began revising organic chemistry according to Brian Coppola, and it was very successful there. He was also a very popular and effective teacher there. I might make a distinction between popular and effective. Brian is both of those. This award tonight is not about a person who is just popular because he's got a great personality or whatever. Brian is an extremely effective teacher. And I went about my merry way off to the East Coast for a postdoc and then came back here and joined the faculty, saddened by the fact that I thought we'd never be together again. But amazingly enough, we hired Brian in 1986 to come here. And I would characterize the department before that time as being surprisingly supportive of undergraduate teaching if you compared it to other large research chemistry departments around the country. I felt my faculty were already in the mode of being in tune to the teaching mission. But I think it has changed dramatically since Brian has come, and I attribute a lot of that to his presence. I don't want to leave out the faculty here that also have been very instrumental in our new curriculum and so forth, but I think Brian was the catalyst for this thing. That's my personal opinion. He certainly was for me. He has accomplished so many things since he's been here in that short time. The major thing has been, as I say, catalyzing the revamping of the undergraduate curriculum, the entire thing. I think it's been a smashing success. He is interested in the evaluation of what this experiment of their new curriculum. How do we test and see if it's working or not? He's brought so many disciplines beyond chemistry into teaching. He's been very, very active in administrative things around the department. He has been co-PI, that means principal investigator, on many grants. I think if you added up the total, it would be well over $1 million worth of money brought into the University of Michigan, partly due to Brian's efforts. He has obtained many awards, as are listed in the program. This is not the first time he's been recognized for his teaching, but he's also been a great PR man for our curriculum, too. We have achieved some level of recognition around the country as an innovator in teaching chemistry, and he's given a number of talks at universities and meetings and so forth. A lot of people are curious about what we're doing. Brian is a very effective communicator of that, and some departments are actually taking on the Michigan model in their own departments. So he has had a great impact on our department. Personally, Brian has had a very strong impact on me as a teacher. However, I don't know how it happened, but I did learn the things I needed to know to be a good learner and teacher of chemistry. But Brian really brought a lot of things out and showed them to me that I didn't know I knew how to do. He's very passionate about addressing specifically how one learns any subject in life, chemistry, university, or whatever. I wish that I had learned about that when I was a kid. I think that would be a wonderful thing to focus on. But besides presenting the subject matter in an effective way, how can we help our students learn how to learn it, how to solve problems, and so forth? He's been very effective at that. And that has really changed the way I teach also. Maybe not as much as the way he teaches, but I've certainly taken on an element. We see very eye to eye on that sort of thing. So in summary, I am not surprised that Brian has achieved this award. I think the students are very perceptive about what goes on in his class. They see his passion and his commitment to not just doing a good job presenting organic chemistry, but he sees that they see that he is concerned with much broader issues in their education. And I think, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be a part of this tonight. We have a real gem here at the University of Michigan. You'll find he's a very engaging and very interesting man. I can't wait to hear what he's going to talk about tonight. Before I turn it over, the title tonight, last lecture, How a Chemist Used Psychology to Repair an Engine and Other Illustrated Stories. Sounds fascinating. But let me turn this over to Sarah Deitch and Deanna Mitchell, who will present the 1994 Golden Apple Award.
I first met Dr. Coppola virtually 3 years ago as a freshman, admittedly a bit apprehensive about starting the introductory organic chemistry sequence. But I soon discovered his course was not exactly what I had expected. His enthusiasm and innovative teaching style led for my appreciation of the course, shattered the stereotypical image of the dull scientist, and quickly transformed my casual interest in chemistry, into the focus of my undergraduate education. Dr. Coppola is an inspirational instructor, a counselor, a mentor, but above all a friend, who has influenced my life and the lives of many other students and professors in many more ways than he will ever know. It is therefore with great pleasure that I present tonight, on behalf of the Shout organization and the students here at the University of Michigan, the 1994 Golden Apple Award to no one that could be more deserving than Dr. Brian Coppola.
Thank you all. First things first. Actually, before I extend the thanks that are deserved, I really want to spend just a second saying a word that apparently is so provocative that it cannot appear on posters and in most articles. Chemistry, 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 chemistry. Although I'll spend some small fraction of the time tonight talking about chemistry and molecules, I do intend to speak most of the evening about issues in teaching and learning and the things that I feel and the things that I think and the things that I've learned over the last few years. One of the ways to describe the goals of instruction is to think about making people come to different points of view, to see the world the way you see it, to maybe expose them to ideas they hadn't thought of before. And to do that, you certainly have to attract someone's attention, I think. All the most interesting things you have to say don't mean all that much if no one's listening. So the purpose of a title really sets the tone. And the title, and the title, and the title, and the title. Oh, Mr. Man, with the slides. Oh. Okay. There we go. How a chemist used psychology to fix an engine, and I left off other illustrated stories, although we'll get to those. What does this evoke? What does it mean? If you're old enough, it makes you think of Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance. Maybe it makes you think of shop class. What I hope is that 12 months from now, that you'll remember the title and maybe its significance. So we'll ponder on that for a second. Why is teaching and learning such an interesting topic to me? Well, one way or the other, I propose, we are all involved in teaching activity in whatever we do. The need for teaching is intertwined with learning, and that is something that I would like to speak of tonight, to have you think of, if not for the first time, to put a different slant, a different point of view on it. Of course, we intertwine these things all the time. One of the things that we say when we're searching for a different way to say we learn is that we teach ourselves. So even in the language, these things become intertwined. And I believe that however you choose to express yourself, whatever it is that you're trying to communicate, you're involved in a teaching activity. Whether you use words, song, dance, pictures, sculptures, or primal screams, you're interested in teaching. You're interested in having somebody see the world, that piece of the world that you're trying to describe the way you see it. There are other ways to express the intricacies of teaching and learning, and so perhaps a more elaborate title or a thesis statement is this, that teaching, I think, is an implicit part of learning and in all other forms of expression. Teaching is what we all do, therefore it's a good idea to talk about it and discuss it, and maybe we can become more effective at doing it. So I'll leave that up there for a few minutes and go through the list of well-deserved thanks, certainly to Michael Brooks for his original and sustained inspiration, to Hillel, to Apple, to the entire list of supporters on the bottom of the program. Sustaining this activity is difficult. I can't tell you how worthwhile it is any better than Professor Fine did, so I won't even think about trying to do that. He really said it all. As Will, thank you for such a beautiful introduction, said, what I do here at the university isn't necessarily what is normally expected or what people do generally. And if you're going to have a professional career doing those sorts of things, you can't do it alone. And so you can't leave out the thanks for your colleagues, your dear friends, family, and I certainly share this with all of them as well as my wife, Peg. That kind of support is needed to do different things. And you can't leave out the students who took time away from their studies and their busy schedules in order to write letters. And so the thanks certainly and sincerely goes out there. Other things to say at the outset, taking a spin from Mark Twain. Any reports of my retirement are an exaggeration. Other reflections on the introductions, I thank Regent Deitch and most of the other speakers for promoting me to a professorship. as much surprise as anyone that someone who teaches organic chemistry, where people are lining up because they have to, is recognized this way. It is an extremely gratifying thing. That doesn't match the usual either, like me. And this isn't a small issue. Really, before I start to talk about psychology and engines and all those things, making you think about what that all means, I want to take a little time looking at the role of chemistry, the business of hiding chemistry as part of the Golden Apple Address. Is this just paranoia? Am I just whining about it? Or what is that business of the role of chemistry in the liberal arts college? Well, I've already flashed by it once, but you can take a longer look this time. We have here a representation of the traditional role of chemistry in LS&A. Is this mere hyperbole? Well, I would like to share some other perspectives along these lines. The things that I've heard, seen, overheard, had emailed to me in the last few weeks changed the beginning of this talk a little bit. In fact, to paraphrase my father a little bit, when I first told my parents about this award, the reaction was very much, and he wasn't alone in this. Students selected you. What the heck is it about chemistry anyway? Is it a marketing problem? Does a general marketing problem lead to a very specific marketing problem? So I'd like to digress here and talk about marketing. Number one, bad press. Chemistry just isn't for everyone. The stories I heard when I was growing up even, the kind of things you hear repeated you over and over. You know, chemistry courses only make two kinds of people. Those who become chemists and those who hate chemistry. And this is a cultural thing, isn't it? Bad marketing number two. Bad word of mouth. Organic chemistry, everyone knows, is the hardest thing there is. Organic chemistry is the weeder course. Organic chemistry decides the careers of future MDs. Lots of people know about organic chemistry. Lots of people who have opinions about alar on their apples and bovine growth hormone. Lots of people know about organic chemistry. Bad advertising. The people who have had some exposure to chemistry have this introduction that they receive in high school, perhaps a year of called general chemistry, and anything that comes after that must be difficult because we know things keep getting harder. And so there's all these three strikes working against you on the first day of class. And it does represent a challenge to meet, as all challenges are, but it does represent a challenge. What about this business of it being difficult? Is it really? Barry Trost really did show us that it wasn't, and it was very, very appropriate of Will to mention him. And I have to say that just practically every graduate student that's trained by Barry goes away with a perspective about teaching. You can pick them out of a crowd lecturing, and that is an influence. In a sense, you do teach the way you were taught. Chemistry is very hierarchical, and so it's difficult. Well, so is everything else. Language is very hierarchical. You just don't wait till you're 20 years old to start speaking. We expect to do it all, and we expect to do it in 8 months, never having had it before, but worse, buying into the bad press, avoiding it. It comes later. It must be harder. It's a message we send. It's bad marketing. and it is an admonishment in general. What the heck is a chemist going to say on April 13th anyway? Is that paranoia and whining? Well, I know for a fact that there was extensive discussion in the Golden Apple Award Committee about the nature of the press and the printing and the title. And I admit to being just a little bit of a rapscallion in the selection of my title. And students too. An email message that was forwarded to me from someone. Recently, I was sitting in the Angel Hall courtyard. I overheard two students talking about Coppola. One student wondered what topic a chemistry professor would lecture on for his last one. She seemed skeptical and went on so far as to say that his last lecture would be boring, consisting of endless reactions, equations, and the function of And yet the most gratifying thing that I can ever hear, and I've heard this, but it isn't secondhand, is if in an interview situation, which sometimes we conduct, you ask a student, well, what did you get out of that class? Well, certainly more than chemistry. That's a really important thing and something that gives you that warm, fuzzy feeling that teachers get. Well, what about this business here? What about the bad marketing? I think that natural scientists become their own worst enemies. I think you start buying into that negative rhetoric and you start living up to the image. I think we are the ones ultimately responsible for the learning activity of trying to get people to understand what we do. It's things that should be done early. You buy into the rhetoric and you change your self-image accordingly, practically like every other ism there is. What does a chemist look like? It evokes an image. What does a historian look like? You know, it's not quite so firm. It isn't just restricted to the natural scientist. I, for example, have a very strong image of what an artist looks like. But if I say, what does a physicist look like? What does a mathematician look like? It probably evokes a very strong image. It generally, certainly if you ask that question of preschoolers and then ask them to draw it, it is not a terribly positive or flattering image. Well, I think we do buy into that rhetoric. I think I bought into that rhetoric, and it's something that I've had to unlearn. Do I think that retroactively? Is hindsight so clear? Well, I happen to have an image captured of me in 1978. We really did have sideburns in 1978. I'm now inclined to say, what's wrong with this picture? What's wrong with this picture is that it affirms imagined fear. You just knew it was like that once the lab door closed. If it was someone else doing it, it would just be a parody. If it's me doing it, it's affirming fear better than Stephen King could ever write. It's your nightmare. As long as I'm taking self-indulgent to an extreme, let me take a look at another self-image. One that I've actually carried with me for a long time. One that most people believe to be true anyway. Yes, 1960, when the world was black and white. Standing at the board. Okay, end of editorial number 1 about chemistry. I promise not to whine about it anymore. One reason that I am drawn to the image of the young learner is that it reminds me of one of the most important things that I ever read that started my professional thinking on the broader issues of teaching and learning. And it's also a good lesson because you never, ever, ever know where you're going to come across those little gems. It's the right time, it's the right place, and they really change your mind. This particular thing that I read was in, of all places, a letter to the editor of a magazine that is no longer published, a magazine called Science 80-something. In 1982, it was called Science 82. In 1983, it was called Science 83. This is the magazine that you now know as Discover. In Science 84, in a letter to the editor, I read, and it's not the whole letter, but it's a piece of it. When my 6-year-old learns that we heat the house with forced air, she immediately wants to know who's forcing the air, where natural gas comes from, and how it got stuck underground. Then she asks, if we don't have natural gas, would we die in winter? There you have geology, engineering, physics, and biology all together in a logical hierarchy of concepts and facts. But a few years from now, my daughter will be studying the structure of Earth's crust, combustion, hydraulics, and the classification of living beings, all in different years, quarters, neatly separated, tested, and graded. And the thing, and it goes on, and the person here starts talking about specific versus holistic education. And this business of compartmentalization and categorization, which is not evil, carries with it a price because it creates boundaries between things that are connected. One of the most common words that you hear in education today is the need to integrate knowledge, the need to integrate across subject matters, to find the connections between chemistry and other things. We don't mean integrate. We mean reintegrate. These things were and are naturally and always connected. We mean reintegrate because we have disintegrated them in the system of formal education, in different classrooms, with different instructors, with different exams, and who talks to the teacher down the hall. It is not an evil to disintegrate. It is an evil to forget that things were already integrated. Preschoolers may be the best learners in a real sense. They haven't learned where the boundaries are. They make very fluid connections, comparisons, analogies. I want to spend just a minute with that idea. Is it mere hyperbole? Well, one of the preschoolers I know is named Alex. Alex is 4 years old, and Alex is awfully cute, so he deserves a picture. Alex and his dad play games. One of the games that Alex and his dad play is Name That Group to songs on the radio. So they were playing Name That Group once, and Alex said, "What's that group, Dad? I don't know what that is." And Dad said, "That's AC/DC." Immediately, Alex cocked his head with that Mr. Data look and said, "Dad, what's the name of that little robot on Star Wars?" Get it? See, your boundaries are too strong. AC/DC, R2D2. Oh. You're surely not too young for Star Wars. Okay, AC/DC, Star Wars, R2D2, I can see that. But it couldn't work for chemistry, could it? Well, Alex's dad is a chemist, and one thing that Alex has been able to do for about a year is identify the pieces in a particular chemistry reaction. Don't anybody leave. Alex can say the names and recognize the shapes of the diene, the dienophile, and cyclohexene and tell you it's a Diels-Alder reaction. He can draw them now, actually. 2 weeks ago, Alex and his dad were playing How Many Fingers Do I Have Up? And so it was this, and it was this, and it was this. And Alex was being a little imaginative and said, "Hey, Dad, how many..." Dad, look, there's a dienophile. Dad, look, there's a dying. Dad, cyclohexene. Which immediately raises Alex to the upper 50th percentile of Chemistry 215. What was Alex doing? Well, let's get back to Alex. He's cuter than the deals. All the reaction. Alex was doing what good teachers do. Alex was making connections. Alex was making things concrete. Alex was making connections and analogies. It supports the notion, I think, that for learning, the business of teaching is intimately tied. You will notice that engines have not been mentioned so far. Editorial number 2. Problems in the business of compartmentalization, formal education, which I like to call institutionalized learning. Problems. Better learning skills do not automatically result from institutionalized education. They can, but it isn't automatic. The problems that I see, and this is with the assistance of all the people that I've learned from, wonderful colleagues like Rich Lawton and Seyhan Ega. The people that I have learned from have helped me in my own thinking, and that's part of the whole business. The responsibility for learning has somehow shifted to teaching. I didn't learn it because you didn't teach it is non-productive finger-pointing. It does not minimize or neglect the role of instruction. It just moves responsibility for learning to funny places. It especially does the most damaging thing, and that is really lowers the capability in a student's own mind of their ability to learn. Instructors have to be sensitive to this too. The business of self-efficacy, the belief that you can take your abilities and then work with them, is an important thing. And if you shift the responsibility over to the teacher to teach, then you are giving up that part of yourself. There are other problems, and you can go on and on and on about the damn thing in grades. And grades can be a problem, but like anything else, they don't have to be. But grades are a problem. Goals for learning shift to lists of prescribed topics and how to get an A. The question isn't, how can I learn it? The question is, how can I get a grade? Is this a cultural or a learned thing? Well, I think one of the most interesting things I've read recently is a report on the work that Harold Stevenson here at the University of Michigan has been doing in his cross-cultural study of pre-college students, and specifically a study he did about math learning, where he was interested in the student perception about what factors were most significant to academic success. And the choices that students in the United States, Taiwan, and Japan had were to consider, where was this most important factor? Was it having a good teacher? Was it native intelligence? Was it a strong and supportive home environment? Or studying hard? In the United States, by far, the dominant answer was the most important factor is having a good teacher. In Taiwan and Japan, it was studying hard. It's a very interesting difference. I can't learn without a class. It's a wrong idea. Like the business of the self-image of the scientist, teachers then also buy into this game and take on too much responsibility themselves. Sorry about that. I cannot take the view that my students cannot learn without me, that they will be lost without me, that I am going to rescue them from the mire of organic chemistry. That's too much responsibility for me and it puts the center of focus in just the wrong place. This responsibility has slid to a national scale where we all have to do the same thing in the same way. Textbook writers have such an awful time today because of so-called market demand. Everything has to be done the same way, and if you want to do something different, well, who's going to buy it? Well, you kind of call that all lumped up business mech education. Prescriptive lists of topics are not necessarily the way to go. You want your slant, your view, your point of view, yours on the thing. And yet all over the country, of course, on the third week of the fall term in Physics 1, everybody's doing the same topic. People talk about this business of vouchers for education like you're going in and choosing between the Big Mac and the fish sandwich. Grades can, but not necessarily, subordinate the goals of learning, of having value associated with that class and the instruction, of the goals of thinking. In an editorial recently written by an author from the former Soviet Union, who reflected on what he observed in the system of grading in the United States, said that the system of grades in the U.S. seems to want to affirm competence without actually getting it, to give the appearance of understanding without actually having to understand. And that's a real problem. And it's a real thing. I've experienced that myself, and one of those seminal events. Back when the university, and some of you have heard this story before, back when the university had a course in human sexuality for the undergraduates, I remember very distinctly standing outside my office and hearing 3 young men walking to their final exam. And the purpose of the human sexuality course, like some others I'll talk about on this campus, is to raise consciousness, to get people who weren't sensitive to these things thinking about them. And yet the question that I heard as one asked the other on the way to the final was, do we have to know the definition of gender identity for the final? It's the wrong thing. It's just the wrong thing to worry about that. The thoughts weren't being processed. It was lists, things to tack up on boards to get an A, to go on to the next course where there were lists of things. If you think about it, we've turned this whole business into a very confrontational one. If you look at the language, if we talk about even learning, we use words like well, I guess strategies is okay. But if you look at the language we use for strategies of learning, achieve mastery of, sink your teeth into, get a handle on, to struggle and wrestle with, these are fairly confrontational phrases. It does not have to be that is the kind of language that we use. It is also not necessarily true that these things are bad, but it does create an image. Well, it sort of creates this image to me. You put in all your work to get to college, you're hanging on by your toenails, and right around the corner, there's just another gauntlet to run. Achieve mastery of. You've got to beat the beast, or else be beat by it. And that's really not a good picture of motivation for me. It is a disturbing outcome to have that sort of ethic. It is terribly disturbing to me when students want to transfer from the University of Michigan because of the anti-intellectual environment they find in their classes because people are just going after grades. It isn't everyone, but it really shouldn't be as prevalent. It is disturbing because of moving past the human sexuality course. We have the important business of, say, the diversity course requirement on our campus. And if it just denigrates into, do we have to know the definition of racism for the final, it's missing its mark. You have to get people thinking about these things, not just affirming competence, but achieving competence being able to engage in the discussion. The possibility that you could affirm competence then overestimates the value of formal education. By this, for example, I mean a phrase that I heard said of both of my grandfathers. And the phrase was, if only they'd been able to go to college. What does a person mean by that? Well, it really means if only they could have had their common sense validated. What it meant was that these people were great thinkers and learners, that they had achieved lots of things, that they were very intelligent people. And it also says the point of view that they were coming to this enterprise. They needed to go to college to take what they had and make it blossom, to make it richer. It said that they had capabilities and that there was then a value to have that expanded. They had capabilities and you wanted them to interact with other people. That's a difference. It's a difference that I perceive when I see students arriving at the university today, plowing their way through the hurdles, beating the beast because what you really need is to get into this or that or the other thing when it's later and you're missing the whole business. Talked a bit about the learner, talked a little bit about the teacher. I want to go back to the basics of the business of everyone does teaching. So we go back to the slide, teaching is an implicit part of learning. I want to talk about the business of responsibilities and the business of the role of instruction. Phrases that I think are important not only for teachers, but also for students, the kinds of new metaphors that we need to change people's minds so they simply do not just repeat the cycles of abuse when it comes to education. The teacher-researcher debate is so far off the mark as not to be funny. I start, as some people have heard me in other audiences say, whether I'm talking with my class on the first day of school, whether I'm talking to parents during orientation or students during orientation, to express the idea that the University of Michigan is a learning institution, that's what we're here for. Thank you very much, Rich Lawton, for helping me learn that. Teachers create learning environments and facilitate learning. These are not mumbo-jumbo words. They are the things that we're supposed to do. We create an environment. We draw people to us. You want them to think about things. That's the responsibility I have. I can't teach you anything. You must learn it. But I can certainly get in the way. And that's a problem. I must think of what it means to facilitate learning. And to me, it means I have to understand something about learning. One secret of teaching is appearing to have known all your life what you learned this morning. A saying attributed to me. What it means is that the expertise I've developed is one of a learner. And I am gratified if in some small way I've helped change the language in LS&A to think of educators as expert learners. And that's the thing I can share, the things I know about learning. It is an in loco parentis issue about learning. And so teachers are expert learners. That's what I need to be able to share. This is a more compelling list to me of the responsibilities that we have as instructors. It's the kind of message that is left out of our education completely. It is the kind of things that have to be shared with students in classrooms so they can know what the heck things are about, especially if they come with a different ethic. Thinking about these sorts, not having thought of these sorts of issues nearly caused one of the shortest academic careers on record, namely mine. What does that mean? Well, my academic career spanned almost September 19 1982 to November 1982. Why is that? Well, the reason is that that was the first year that I started doing formal instruction in organic chemistry. And as wonderful as Barry Trost was, actually, he still forgot to tell us some very important things. One of the most important things was that not everybody loves organic chemistry and wants to know it. It's one of those nice boundaried things about graduate school. You never question those assumptions because you're all there because you want to be there to do that thing because you're the people carving out that particular small piece of the world. It was clear to me in November of 1982 that the class of 30-some students in my organic chemistry course did not need to know what a Grignard reagent was. It simply didn't matter. That content didn't matter. It was so important for me to know, for them to know. And I tried to say it in the way they'd understand and all that sort of stuff. But the first thing on my list in my course was for them to know all that chemistry. And somewhere along the way, it troubled me deeply because as I started to look, it wasn't as though they weren't interested. I was really thinking about them and why they were there. And unless they were really going to go into it or even peripherally near it, did they really need to know that piece of information? And why did I have to teach it? And why was it there in that chapter? And it made me start thinking of those things. Well, at the same time, I was thinking of that. And I might articulate that concern in 1994 a little more carefully than I actually did in 1982, but I knew something was troubling me at least. It was a cold November day. And I was working on my 1976 yellow Pinto. The engine part is coming. And I needed to replace the thermostat. And after about 2 hours on a cold November in Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin, in my driveway, not in the garage, because it was too crowded, grease, I tell you, to here, because none of the tools I had I could make fit down in that engine block. At the height of my frustration trying to fix that, I actually, truly stepped back and had one of those little conversations you have with yourself every now and then. And said, you know, you're a trained PhD. You'd think you ought to be able to solve the problem. Oh yeah, I'm supposed to be a problem solver. Seems reasonable that ought to extend somewhere beyond Grignard reactions into getting that bolt off that engine block. Once I looked at it as a problem that I could define, look at the tools I had available, nothing was really good, so I invented a new tool and the thing was off and fixed in about 5 minutes. While I was ecstatic, I had found my purpose, the business of problem solving. Why hadn't anybody told me about this? Or if they were, why wasn't I listening? Why wasn't it compelling to hear it? Why wasn't the development of that ethic rewarded? Did even people think about these things? So I ran into class the next day, still with a fair amount of grease on my fingers, and I stood up and I said, "Class, I've had this business troubling me, and now I understand why you're here." And I proceeded to tell them the story of the engine and the thermostat and the bolt and epiphany. And they sort of looked at me with that Mr. Data look. And we went on. But it was a seminal event for me, because I really started then to look at what I was doing very differently. And I started to really wonder about that question. Did people think about this? Was anybody thinking about this? And about 2 years later, I came across that letter to the editor in Science 84. And in another part of the letter, I was just astounded, because then I knew other people thought about it. While in the other part of the letter, this same writer wrote, through the years of experience, students, myself included, finally teach themselves, learn, to view their knowledge as an integrated interactive body. Cognitive science. What's that, cognitive science? I never heard of that before. Well, I only had 4 electives in my chemistry major. Cognitive science has confirmed the business of the inefficient pattern of learning, and this faculty member at Berkeley introduced undergraduates to a basic concept in physics in 2 ways, conventional and holistic, and it resonated strongly with me. I was like, yeah, that's what I'm doing. And so I needed to find out more about it. So I read this article in the American Journal of Physics, which led to a 3-word phrase, which is very, very important to me, the business of cognitive process instruction. Yeah, that's what you need to do. It's the whole classical image of learning about learning. Cognitive process instruction. Learning how to learn. That's our goal. That's the value. And that really started my own, really, for the first time, seeking out, teaching myself those parts of my own education that were missing, that impinged greatly on finding value of walking into classrooms and talking about organic chemistry. And it really started a cascade. Other words that had meaning, even 10 years later. So in this next part, I want to talk about things I've learned, sometimes a long time after people tried to teach them to me. The first one has to do with the role of history and sociology and all kinds of things that impinge on what is today. The most important class I ever took as an undergraduate, the one that I learned the most in, and the one whose lessons really are the most meaningful for me today, was a 2-term course in the history of science. History. And on the first day of class, Cecil J. Schneer, inorganic chemist, crystallographer turned historian of science, walked into class and said, "Class, nothing comes from nothing." And I dutifully wrote it down. Attributed it to either Cecil Schneer or Rogers and Hammerstein, and went on. Cecil actually is how I pronounced it. Cecil, many times during the course, said, "Nothing comes from nothing." And he structured his course around that. And there were lessons that I could begin to perceive in what he was saying, but I wasn't quite all that ready to hear it. And years later, the lessons in that class just recoil as I begin to understand what he was talking about. Nothing comes from nothing. And understanding the antecedents, whether it means historically, whether it means just prior knowledge, whether it means interpret it the way you want, but it is part of the historical string that event leads to event, leads to event, and the whole business of causation plays greatly in understanding the way we understand the world today. And quite explicitly, as anybody in my classes know, the role of history in instruction in chemistry, the role of language in inventing words and where those things come from, to understand what it means to understand chemistry the way chemists understand it, is an important thing to me. So, let's get concrete here and give a little lesson in what that means. Some of you have seen part of this lesson before, others of you haven't. Today, class, we're going to talk about hemp. Part of understanding the role of this overall topic in science has to do with history, understanding even that the word hemp means dry vegetation or hay, coming from a Greek word, cannabis. Somehow appropriate to the University of Michigan. In early April. Somehow. And that people investigate things in chemistry. People are interested in material,
their origins, the business of refinement and purification, and one of the things that people did historically and really still do is the business of separation. And so, even in the year 1600, and this whole lesson in hemp becomes a little mini lesson in the history of chemistry and the kinds of procedures and questions and the way questions are answered in chemistry. And so we have the business of the essential oil or the extract, and you can go to Kroger's today and find essential oils. The business of extracting from natural sources the thing that is the essence, the essential oil. Whether you squish it out or extract it out, a material was isolated from this hay, which was conceived of as the essential oil. How do you know it's the essential oil? Well, it's the one where you get the same physiological activity that you get from the hay. Hashish. Around 1800, there was a classification of this material. Around 1847, the physiological activity was attributed to a resin which was derived from further refinement of the extract. How do you know where the active thing is? Well, people take the sample, divide it into pieces by some way or the other, and they test it, looking for activity. And if you tell stories about pheromones and how people detected where the sex attractants were, they really used the same strategy, holding moths near the output of a gas chromatograph, waiting for them to beat their wings fervently as the sex attractant came rolling off from lots of components. It's the same idea. Isolated from the oil in the late 1800s is a material, and by now we had the skill to analyze for elemental composition something with the elemental formula, C21H26O2. It was isolated and discovered to be inactive. Put it aside, but name it. And in the business of naming, and this ties in a bit into economics, we have commercially available, if you check in catalogs of this era, available from Merck of Darmstadt, a material that Canada's resin. If you want to go and work on this research and isolate those things, then you can open up to a catalog and buy this stuff. Well, this particular material that was isolated does the reactions characteristics of alcohols, and so you invent a name that captures what it was and what it is, cannabinol. And then around 1930, the connectivity of those atoms was determined. And there it is. And as a really strong lesson in where the whole art of synthesis came from, in 1940, people synthesized that independently as a proof of the structure, which is the origin of the business of organic synthesis. Is this the structure? Well, let me make some of what I think it is and do comparisons. And this is characteristic of the kind of procedure we use today. The difference is we can do it much more rapidly. If we move from the 40s to the 60s, the 1964, the active component, C21H30O2, was isolated, and with respect to the C21H26O2 formula, there were 4 extra hydrogens. So what do you call it? Tetrahydrocannabinol, THC. And in 1967, in a significantly shorter time than it took to do the business in the first place, the structure and end synthesis of the molecule was determined, which then opens up all sorts of other interesting questions. Where in the brain is this interacting? Where is the cannabinoid receptor, and why is it there? Is it evolutionarily significant that there is a place in the brain that responds to THC? Or is there another natural function that we can learn about? Is it just for THC? Probably not. What is the natural binding agent? Whoa. Is it just me? In 1990, well, 1990, the identity and cloning of the gene done for of the receptor was done to bind THC, a very strong and positive statement about some of the advances in biochemistry. And the brain location and the abundance of these receptors was consistent with the areas of movement control, memory, and emotions, many of the common physiological activities. And because this could be done, the search was then on, and you see how rapidly this progress takes place now. The search was on for what is the natural ligand, and what can we learn about that? And in 1992, the material was isolated. It is the natural material that no one had seen before, that is the result of this historical strand, and yet it contains in its own discovery a lot of the same elements. You start with lots of stuff like 4.5 kilos of pig brain and a blender, and you get out 0.6 milligrams of a material that was named anandamide. Why do you name it anandamide? Because the functional group there of significance is amide, and the Sanskrit word for bliss is ananda. And so even today we play that same game. And what are we learning about the way humans operate? And here are the rules of the game, and you can play it too. What would you name it? And the power of synthesis in the modern age. Within days, the material was isolated, identified, synthesized in multi-gram quantities in 15 to 30 minutes. And that progress, it repeats the theme over and over again. And it's not just enough to say, here's the structure and here's the synthesis, but it's much more compelling to look at the way humans have behaved, to see that there's repetition in there, and where's the next question, and where's the next question. And I haven't been able to follow this up too successfully, but because you can make it in 15 to 30 minutes, has there now been activity in the illicit drug market because of the ease of preparing this? Are the starting materials now regulated, which is an economic and social function? And where is it going? And it's just an interesting story that you see unfold. Other things I've learned. Well, we take the normal thing about forest and trees and not being able to see the forest for the trees, and you realize, well, you can't see the forest without the trees either. Categorization is okay, but you just cannot disintegrate that from the business of the big picture. Relating individual facts and pieces into assembled meaning, and that the assembled meaning somehow transcends those individual facts, is an important lesson. And if you spend all your course time on just the little facts, and you don't step back and share the big picture as an instructor, that's a bad thing. Even if it's so plain to you, of course, people don't see it because they haven't been exposed to it. You also can't. Anyway, you can't get the assembled meaning from just one piece either. And now I'm starting to talk about the business of overall education. You can't get the assembled meaning of inquiry into the natural world that humans do by just having chemistry courses. The business of categorization and the relationship to the larger picture is something that lots of people have thought about for lots of time. One person who thought about the business of forests and trees and classification was the chemist Lavoisier. Lavoisier in 1793 wrote a very, very interesting and long essay in French trying to really say the same thing about forests and trees and the importance of classification, but not losing the big picture. Lavoisier is the person who is historically primarily responsible for the business of nomenclature, for sitting down and doing that systemization, for bringing it out in popularization. And Lavoisier was really saying, if I may paraphrase the French, that you really cannot get a properly developed meaning of tree if all you do is study oaks. And you must take the individual pieces and make forays into the various areas in order to see what that larger picture is. And you can't just talk at the philosophical level of the larger picture, because you really then aren't discussing anything. And so the business of larger picture and smaller pieces and that assembly is an important thing. And you can read the French, you can talk about forests and trees, but one of the things that I like to do is say it with a picture. I prefer a pictorial metaphor. And so it starts with this picture. What is that a picture of? No, it's not a cat. There's no cat that I ever saw that looked like that. It's blobs of white on dark. And yet, because of your prior experience, and yet, because of what the psychologists call gestalt completion, you make things like foreground and background, and you lump together the little pieces to the greater whole. And this, then, is a pictorial metaphor for the assembly of knowledge in individual concepts. And it works at lots of levels. One of the levels it works at is, here is the first thing I talk about, and up there is the second thing I talk about, and I am forced, because of time's arrow, to talk about one thing at a time in some order. I cannot talk about all of them at once. But you can't just perceive my little topics of whatever thing I'm talking about, which I'm using these patches of white to represent. You can't just view them as the end. I'm trying to talk about a larger picture. Unfortunately, although you're hearing those one at a time, I'm walking in there with a completely assembled picture that I'm working from. So one of the things that I must always remember is what it's like not to see that bigger picture. One thing I have to remember is to say, today we're talking about cats, before I first start talking about legs and ears and paws and necks. And if it gets into areas that are less familiar, it becomes more confounding. If I go in and say, today we're talking about chemistry, and you have no experience in it, then saying it is practically worthless. Today we're going to talk about these things. And I have a fully articulated image of what this little woodland creature is. And I can go in and talk about it piece by piece. And it all makes perfectly good, consistent sense to me. And I know all the assumptions that I'm using, including the fact that it's upside down. Now you see the picture I do, maybe. And of course, I take great pride when I go to class for the people who see the same picture that I do immediately, because everything I say after that point makes perfect sense to them. But for the people who don't see that picture that I do right away, have a great deal of frustration. I see a bunny. Do you see a bunny? And of course, if this is a pictorial metaphor for chemistry and the information that I use in class and how it's assembled into a larger picture, then this really isn't a good pictorial metaphor for chemistry. This is a good pictorial metaphor for chemistry. And I go into class and I talk about this, and I go into class and I talk about that, and I go into class and I talk about that. And if some fraction of my audience sees the picture that I see quite naturally on the basis of a few things that I say, then that's good and they're happy and everything makes sense. And everybody else just struggles and struggles. Do you see the same picture that I do? Some of you have seen this before. Instructors, you know, extending this pictorial metaphor, even forget to walk in and say, today we're talking about dogs. That's a useful thing to know. It works here in this audience because you got some familiarity about dogs. I walk into class and say we're talking about chemistry, and I have to do a little more work to make sure I'm talking about the bigger picture of that at the same time I'm talking about the small pieces. This works on lots of levels, reminding me, because I cannot see this without seeing a photograph.
reminding me that not everybody sees that right away, reminding me that I can only talk about one place at a time. And the thing, because of experience, where I think it works the best to share this and try to explain it to students, is that it becomes a metaphor for persistence. The role that the little pieces play in the assembly of the larger picture means, and if you haven't seen it yet, what you are doing now is accessing your prior knowledge about dogs, and you are grouping and ungrouping. And you feel very comfortable taking the risk of ungrouping the imagined dog that you see. And that's what you need to do to try to see the picture that I'm doing, testing for internal consistency. It's kind of a little dog, I don't know, is it something like Picasso would have done? Maybe I see a dog. And we have to spend our time in a dialogue, and I've got to finally say, well, can you point to the head, the butt, the tail? Is it the whole body? Is it the head? Which way is it looking? And so slowly, you're taking the risk of ungrouping your original picture and regrouping it, and ungrouping and regrouping. And there's a degree of intellectual risk there that you're willing to take because you're not worried about getting an A, maybe. It is a metaphor for persistence because you are convinced that there is a larger picture there you can see. This is the kind of thing that becomes valid content for a course in organic chemistry, because what I want people to do when they encounter new and admittedly difficult information is to be convinced that there is a picture there to see, and that you must take the risk of grouping and ungrouping until you'll finally say, I've seen the dog. Or, even better, where you're having that difficulty and you don't say, chemistry, I can't do chemistry. And instead you say, well, I just haven't seen the dog yet. It's a metaphor for persistence. And I am just gratified as all get out when I hear students actually say at the end of the term, as we're heading into difficult material, I just haven't seen the dog yet. And people say that. And it's something of changing their minds and providing reasons for persistence. You can do it. You can learn it. You can take your capabilities that you have and apply it to this. And if you haven't seen the dog that I see, is there maybe even a different dog there that's even a little more articulated, or do we still have to work at it? And there is a degree of frustration, and I like talking about this pictorial metaphor in audiences of chemistry instructors, especially for the ones that haven't seen the dog yet, because I can then just click past the slide and say, now you know how it feels when you just go on to a next topic. Yes, I know I'm guilty of it too, but I'm learning. Providing new metaphors for instructors and students is an important thing. Recall that we do naturally categorize and subcategorize, but we also create assemblies. So I'm going to go on, but we'll get back to the dog in just a little while. A speech. And we'll run through these fairly rapidly. We do assemble things. We talk about the pieces, but we talk about the bigger part that is not necessarily derivable from the smaller parts. And a speech, and I can take individual levels of study, and I can talk about the rules of studying those things and the resultant system. And the system of words is not derivable from just vocal sounds. There are particular rules there that we invent. And this assembles in a hierarchical fashion. But we don't lose sight somehow, because expression is such a natural part of speaking, of what that larger need is. It is impossible just to spend your time focusing on the vocal sounds and make any sense. And in chemistry, we can look at the hierarchy, the building,
that we have created of electrons and subatomic things and into atoms and molecules and associated molecules in chemistry. And I argue, in a very classical way, that we do this even in our categorization of the natural world. And all of a sudden, many of the traditional fields of study appear as we go from the things that physics does to the things chemistry does. And I'm not being reductionist here. I don't believe that if you understand math, you can understand the rest of the world. There are things having to do with the assembly which are unique, not derivable from the individual, in much the same way that the temperature of a molecule is meaningless, it is an aggregate property. And that we have this business of living and non-living aggregations, and even some others having to do with larger aggregations. And I would also argue that the natural world, which is divided into perhaps the physical world and the social world, is also hierarchically organized. And here's maybe a picture of my dog that I see of the natural world, and out from it falls many of the subject matters that you see in pre-college education, that you see people taking college, and you can, and I would be delighted to share the points of view about where is the beginning in terms of the business of what is the language and the mode of expression, and that at the most intimate level we have causal events and the kinds of things people do to describe them, and the idea that in the social world that perhaps a being really is represented by the sequence of causal events and the interactions of beings and other beings and beings and environment which parallel the biology-geology thing. And have I ranked these things this way because I may think that there are connections between what's on the left and what's on the right? Maybe. Certainly, the metaphors we use in chemistry are similar to the ones we use in psychology. We talk about things being electron-loving and electron-hating. And at the level of biology and sociology, we talk about cultures in both. And how about the lower right-hand corner? Certainly, Isaac Asimov had an opinion about this in the whole business of psychohistory in the Foundation series, and the business of the larger planetary and galactic social systems. Asimov was thinking about these things. And it is one piece, one part of the dog of the natural world, chemistry is. It occupies no more or less important place than any of the others. And some people spend their time chewing away, perhaps another bad metaphor, at that. Other people beat on it. And other people, I think, benefit greatly of what you're supposed to do in education is move from these things and to reintegrate and make those connections. But why is somebody always after you to take all of these different sorts of courses? This provides a rationale that I am very comfortable with. It's a point of view. It's a greater picture of a dog I see. Share with me sometime the dog you see in that business, because I think it's worthy of debate. Third thing, having to do with things I've learned, and that is the business of resolving false dichotomies. What is a false dichotomy? Well, here's one. Tastes great, less filling. That's a false dichotomy. In fact, they want you to buy into the whole business that these things are opposites when they're not opposites at all. The opposite of taste great is taste bad. Right? And Another view of this isn't tasting and filling on opposite sides of a bipolar model, but instead it's a quadrupolar model. And it turns out that we do this thing of false dichotomies all the time in education. One of the things that's gone round and round this century is the business of content and process. Is it supposed to be thinking skills we're after, or is it supposed to be things we're thinking about we're after? Yes. How can you think if you don't have something to think about? How can you have things to think about if you don't know how to think about them? Content and process is a classical false dichotomy. And it drives, if you have the image of these things as opposites and you are an instructor, it drives the way you think. It is significant to think about this because it drives the way you think. It causes you to define things negatively. If you believe that content, the facts, and process, the thinking about them and how you get them, if you believe that those things are opposites, then when you go in to design a new curriculum and you're worried about the fact that your current curriculum is so content-driven, if these things are opposites, then you can define process instruction as not content. If they are opposites, you can define what you do negatively rather than being proactive with your design. You can simply state, if you believe that these are opposites, that I will stop teaching so much content and therefore I will be doing process. And that's wrong because this is a false dichotomy. And instead, content and process is a quadrupolar thing, and we need to strive to be up in the upper right-hand quadrant because you gotta know things, and you gotta know how they're related, and you have to know how to get them. And if you just have a lot of content up with not a lot of process left, then you're an encyclopedist. You know how, but you don't know the whys and what fors. You don't know how they're connected. And so you go in and you can be rote. Jim Wandersee coined a wonderful, wonderful term for the people in the lower right-hand quadrant. They are the intellectual amnesiacs. They know a lot of good things about thinking, but they do all the wrong things. They put together acids and bases in their mechanisms. And then, of course, there is the unengaged. But you know, there really are very few people down there, at least that I see. The system has filtered them long, long ago. And yet, there seems to be a very strong reliance on people being encyclopedists. And there seems to be, to me, a very, very bad false dichotomy of content and process that people use. And it is not restricted to the business of content and process. It has everything to do with laboratory courses, because people talk about, I don't want to do cookbook laboratories, I want to do discovery laboratories. Well, what does it mean? Well, I take the directions away. It's not a good idea. That's not what that's about. You need to know how to do things, but also how then to apply it into the discovery process. You need things. If you didn't need things and specific subjects to think about, then college would be a very expensive one-term course called Learning 101. You would learn how to learn, and that would be it. And so to keep you longer, there would be Learning 102 and Learning 103 and Learning 104. But of course, that's exactly what we have, because the only way you can learn is to learn about things and go for the broader lesson as you're learning about these things and these things and these things to make those connections. If you don't have things to learn about, you're not learning anything. The learning-teaching business is also a dichotomy, and do I have that slide? Yes, it sort of also works for them. And up the upper right-hand quadrant is really where I want to see people move. I want learners who also consider the need to express what they learn, the teaching part. I want you to think about the idea that when you go into a situation needing to express what you're doing, that you go about it very differently. Certainly, in the classes where expression is an explicit need, like in art, you have to worry about expression. You have to worry about the communication that you're making. In chemistry, expression is also a natural part. It happens that we use exams to do that, but during an exam, we are asking for expression, to explain, not to dump the answer from the encyclopedia. Another way to say this, you could go to today's Michigan Daily. If I said, go to the Michigan Daily today and read the editorial, it may be about me. Read the editorial, let's come back and we'll talk about it. Then you conceive of what it would be like to do that. You can imagine that activity, and that you would achieve a certain degree of personal knowledge because of that activity. When you get back, I say, oh, no, I forgot the rest of what I was going to tell you. I want you to go read the editorial in the Daily. It's fairly interesting because I want you to prepare a critique, a presentation to give in front of the Rackham Auditorium tomorrow. I dare say that you would approach your learning differently because of the preconceived need for expression. And that when you think of yourself as needing to be a teacher, of creating an environment for people to learn in, that it isn't just the business of the presentation, but at the front end, you go about the business of learning very differently, even though your degree of personal knowledge might not be that much different given those two tasks. Your approach, your appreciation, and your ability to do that would be different. Teaching plays an integral role of learning in learning, and I believe that the people who come to this so-called naturally, and this is of concern to me because I worry about why are such capable people in Chemistry 215 seemingly unable to take their capabilities and put that together. And it very well could be then that the distribution is based on people who come to their learning very naturally with the need to think about teaching. That they're building up the methods of expression at the same time that they're learning, because it fits all of the things and advice that instructors have given people for years as study tips. Things like study with others. During exams, students are the teachers. Our roles change during an exam. I'm just someone asking you to explain this to me. I'm the student, you're the teacher. Everybody knows you don't know it till you teach it. Why is that? Good tutors listen and ask questions. They don't just recite things. These are all tied in with the importance of the teaching function, and I believe the teaching function as it applies to learning. And that in courses where there are natural, explicitly indicated needs for expression, you come to it very naturally. Art, theater, dance, English. And in others, that role has been minimized, favoring the encyclopedist's point of view, with responsibility taken on too strongly by the instructors to teach things. It's not just the presentation part, it's how the presentation plays in the preparation. And this then becomes the kind of story I need to share with students. Concrete examples of how to behave if they're not coming in with the right perception. To see whether or not minds can be changed by a different point of view. So,
teaching is an implicit part of learning, and also all other forms of expression. And how a chemist used psychology to fix an engine goes well beyond the Pinto story. Because really that had nothing to do with it. The engine I was talking about was my engine, the thing that drives me professionally. About how finally having access to these other things drives me, and how it fixed the thing that drives me, my professional ambition to pursue these things, to seek out and sort of define my dog in this business. And so it is a literal story and a metaphorical story, but the engine I really had in mind was the thing that drives me professionally, and how having access to that fixes that. February 2027. Thanks to Professor Fine and the people in the state of Michigan, I will no longer have to retire in 2027 when I will turn 70. And because I'm still fairly young in this business and so forth, and perhaps never have the opportunity in 2027 to be self-indulgent again, I thought that I would just spend the last couple of slides talking about some of the things that I hope to be talking about in 2027. These are proposals. These are the things that drive my engine now. They are things that I think you will see connect with the importance of the other disciplines. So, 2027, what are the things I want to talk about? I want to talk about a notion I have of teaching with trust. When you come up with an acronym for things, it has to also connect as a word. And the idea of teaching with trust is a very good one. It really boils down to one thing: having respect as a listener. Believing that other people create other dogs. Believing that when somebody tells you something, they're saying it for a reason. That they're using some internally consistent set of decision with respect to the dog they see. And if you want to engage in the conversation of your disagreement, if you want to engage in teaching at the point of disagreement or as a part of education, then teaching with trust means that you first must trust what the person is saying, have respect for their point of view, and this was originally going to be teaching with trost. Because actually this outlines what Barry does so well. The first thing he does is listen, and he always assumes you're saying something for a reason. And whenever I see wrong answers on exams, wrong being defined by the thing I wasn't expecting or the thing I think is incorrect, I always assume the person has put it down there after thinking about it. And it isn't the little letters and lines that are wrong, it's the process to get there, and how can I correct that? What am I going to learn from what the person is saying? And that's what Barry did. What do I need to learn from what the person is saying? So I need to start from the end and retrace. What's the decision before that? And what's the decision before that? And what's the decision before that? Until you finally come to understand the point of disconnection. Then you must create a strategy to take the person down the path that you want them to take, to learn how to make those decisions, because if you just correct the answer, it's no good. If you don't correct the process, because the next time you're going to walk down that path, you'll take the same wrong route. Then and only then do you engage in the teaching activity. Thing number 2 that I'd like to talk about a number of years from now, something I call Project. You always need a title to start with, and then you sort of fill in under that. Project Triad. I think it is terribly, terribly important that the most tragic disconnection we have made is the disconnection between science departments, science educators, and teachers. That the teachers who are the front line interventionists, the teachers who play the same role as graduate students do in research groups, front line researchers interacting with the starting materials,
These are the people that we need to re-establish communication with so that all of our various expertise and experiences can be brought to the problem of education and we don't end up reinventing the wheel. And very significantly, that the people in the sciences respect what the people who are the teachers do, who respect what the science educators do, that everybody has their agendas, that everybody can learn from the others. And so one of the things that I find myself drawn to and personally involved with is trying to create those triads, to try and open up the avenues of communication, to learn from one another and to not just cast teachers in the pre-college years off without ever allowing them the opportunity to come back. And it seems that people in the medical profession are tuned into this very well because they are comfortable with the idea of practitioners and also the people who are doing the research and how you must constantly learn and communicate instead of just being cast adrift. Other things I want to be talking about, very, very significantly, number 3, that learning skills, the things that we really know about learning today, can be transmitted to the aid of learners, but that these things don't become institutionalized, like diversity classes, like the health class, the sex class. Anyway, that if it just becomes Learning 101 that you have to take and it becomes just another thing to get an A in, you can hear the person outside my office now, do I have to know what learning is for a final? That we must think of all of our courses the way we do other forms of expression. That courses need to have built into them the idea of studio time, like you have in the arts, where people can get together and perform their abilities in front of one another for the process of correction. And when you're performing, you're teaching, because you're trying to express what you're thinking and the things that you see to other people. And so to link the business of the science classes to the business of learning skills courses to studio time, whatever that is, where people can come together and put their thoughts on the wall and learn to share them and critique and teach. And then the collaborations between science faculty, psychologists, education science, the people who think about thinking, but you got to think about thinking. I spend my life getting 20 PhDs in things in order to try and make progress in this. And so I must learn to be literate in these other areas. I learn to be able to communicate so that we can then make progress together, like all other collaborations in all other arenas. Remaking natural connections that were there already. So, what will you carry away from all this? I hope that I have made you think about lessons about knowledge and how knowledge may be assembled. I hope that you walk away remembering that seeing the dog is a metaphor for persistence, the belief in capabilities, and that you understand that lesson. I hope that somebody tomorrow or the day after makes you reflect and say something about something you might have learned tonight. I hope that you're compelled to tell them the story about the dog and persistence, and that there's things about learning. I hope you remember that you will then be the teacher, and that you'll have to think about the presentation of the idea in order to explain it to someone else. And to assist you in this, as you exit, you'll be able to pick up a little pin. Because I want somebody to be wearing that little pin to come up and sort of look at your lapel and say, what the hell does that mean? Thank you and good night.